Dr. Campbell, what is your background and how did you develop an interest in the study of origins?
Well, my interest in the subject of origins is an offshoot of my professional work. I'm professionally a rhetorician. I teach in the Department of Speech Communication at the University of Washington. And one of the best kept intellectual secrets from popular culture is that the art of rhetoric is actually a respectable academic discipline. That we are an ancient art, the original liberal arts. Perhaps you have heard of a liberal education. That was one of the things that my ancient predecessors in ancient Greece and Rome invented. The idea of public speaking was that this is an art that is illegal to teach to slaves, but it is the necessary art for the free person, which in those times was the free male. And as Aristotle put it, the function of our art is actually not to give public speeches. That is one of its expressions. But he defined the art of rhetoric as the faculty of discovering in the individual case the available means of persuasion on any subject whatsoever. So you see what this art is. It's an event of intellectual discovery before it is a performing art. The first thing is to discover what is it possible to say on any particular subject, particularly in those situations that are contested, where there are different points of view on the same thing. Now, the particular concern I have with origins stemmed originally from my doctoral dissertation and from my subsequent work, which is in the burgeoning contemporary cross-discipline of the rhetoric of science. There is an important sub-discipline that is developing in this country and also in Europe that is concerned with the rhetoric of science, the persuasive dimension of science. And this is understood not simply in a pejorative sense, but it is something that stems from the very nature of the scientific enterprise. Particularly, I mean, there are many phases. There would be almost dead rhetoric in the sense that even a specialist within his or her discipline is going to have to explain some things that require some shorthand. And these will be argumentative conventions that virtually have the status of cliche, that one will simply have to explain in vis-a-vis so-and-so and so-and-so and the X effect, the Y effect, blah, blah, blah. It contextualizes the argument so that one professional can communicate to another professional, evoking the relevant background knowledge. So that would be one example of a rhetoric of science, almost at the level of cliche. There's another level that comes when we are at a more fundamental, in a more fundamental task with respect to intellectual revolution. And this is, I teach a course in rhetorical perspectives in intellectual revolution. And when it's when we don't have conventions, or when the conventions are the very things that are being contested. Thomas Kuhn refers to this, of course, as the famous paradigm shift. And here we have resort to argumentation at the extremes. How am I to convince you to view the world in a fundamentally different way when, by definition, a revolution is a basic change? I mean, there is a kind of catch-22 there. How can I show you something that's radically different? If this were conventional, I would say, well, you use the most available means of persuasion, but I'm overturning convention. How can I use convention to overturn convention? And I've been a student for many years of Darwin, and I think he is very instructive as a case study in the rhetoric of science, because he addresses precisely, here is an audience that is raised to believe that organic nature is the product of a design. William Paley, in his Natural Theology, spells out the basic grammar of this point of view. If design, then designer. If something is adapted to an end, to a purpose, there must be a proposer. When we find means, he takes the case of the human hand, or you take a finger, there's a hinge. Well, such a contrivance, a development, an adaptation of means to end. And when we find contrivance, there must be a contriver. So that is indeed the commonsensical way of viewing the world. Even Dawkins, in his Blind Watchmaker, affirms it as the commonsensical way, because biological systems have on their face the implication that they are machines, and we naturally think they must be manufactured. And Dawkins says, well, of course, that's the naive first perspective, but really they're the products of chance. You see, what's interesting here is Dawkins' confession that over 100 years after Darwin, first impressions remain first impressions. Prima facie, the organic world bears the aspect of design. And that's what he proposes to explain away. That it has to be explained away shows the monumental character of Darwin's rhetorical challenge. So you see, what I'm interested in, there's an interesting intellectual problem here. And it is properly a rhetorical question. And when, of course, we say that, I mean, well, that's one of those questions that really doesn't mean much. No, when we come to those basic things that define reality, that's a rhetorical question of a different order. How do you pull off a scientific revolution? And what's instructive about Darwin is that he invokes the conventions of his time, the very conventions of the argument to design, in order to overcome design.
How was Darwin able to change the perception of design in nature from theistic to naturalistic for his 19th century audience?
Well, a very interesting question is how Darwin was able to accomplish this technically. That is to say, how can you take an audience accustomed to the argument to design, raised on the argument to design, and present them a world that is the product of what conventionally we might call chance? That there really isn't a design, that the organic structure is a result of a mind-boggling number of contingencies, none of which were planned from the outset. The key here, well, there's several keys. One, perhaps it's useful to simply point out that natural selection is a kind of a contradiction in terms. Selection is conscious. We talk the term selection. If I showed you 4 items and I asked you select from among those, you would pick one. But if I were to take those 4 items and put them in a sieve and shake them, and some of them, because of their size or shape, fell through and others weren't, we wouldn't call that a selection. We would call that sifting. Now, the process that Darwin is talking about is sifting. There's no selection. Nature doesn't select. In fact, to understand the concept properly, one of the first things you must realize is there's no selection to the process at all. It is a complex statistical notion that given Malthus's laws of population, given that many more creatures are born than can survive, given that the context in which they are born is constantly changing, the biogeographic conditions of life are changing, then what you end up with at the end of the day is organisms that are different than their parents. And the time is variable. You go on for a long period of time, you'll discover that the organisms that we know taxonomically were descended from an earlier group of organisms will be different from their parents in some way. Now there's the Malthusian process. But if you were to tell a Victorian audience that it was through this process that structures as complex as the eye were to be formed, they would laugh at you. In fact, Darwin recognizes that straight up. In his account of the eye, he says, to suppose, now this is a very complex Darwinian sentence that's got many clauses, and I'm going to leave some of them out. He says, but to suppose that a structure as complicated as the eye could have been formed by natural selection is, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. Or perhaps he says seems, and then of course he makes his comeback. But the key here is to overcome the absurdity. The absurdity of believing that random, what we would call chance variations, may go somewhere is socially absurd. Now, natural selection is based on an analogy with domestic breeding. And it is by invocation of the domestic breeding analogy that Darwin is able to overcome the social absurdity of his central doctrine. What he does in chapter 1 of The Origin of Species, there's the first 4 chapters of The Origin describe basically a stair step. We begin with variation under domestication. We advance in chapter 2 to variation under nature. In chapter 3, there's struggle for existence. And then chapter 4, which Darwin says in a letter to his publisher Murray, is the keystone of my arch. In chapter 4, we find natural selection. Now, central to accomplishing this task is his analogy with the breeder. And he takes domestic pigeons, and he asks in the first chapter, well, where did these come from? You see, if things are supposed, we believe that things are created, and he does not mention creation in the first chapter of The Origin. But where do you suppose our domestic animals and plants came from? Well, we know where they came from. They came, and then he invokes the tremendously commercially successful example of domestic breedings. We know where our flocks and herds came from, and they came through, and then he gives the whole example of how selection has improved these things. It's a very market analogy, and he even affirms the fact, nor is natural selection an hypothetical principle. And how, what's the proof here? The tremendous amount of money that English breeders have gained for their animals, the Hereford cattle. Now, our racehorses are we know they're descended from Arabian stock, but how much better they are than any native Arabian breed. Well, I see now there is something here, slight variations given our artificial standards, and they have changed the nature of the breed. And Darwin tells us, using the case of the rock pigeon, the pigeon is a very good example because English gentlemen pigeon fanciers would breed these, and they get the most absurd, the pouter, it goes, barrels out its chest, and is really, from our standpoint, very vain. Or the tumbler, this poor bird with this nervous tick. Here the thing is flying around, suddenly goes, it just kind of somersaults in the air, this kind of thing. So he's got about 9 different breeds of pigeons that are just way different. Lo and behold, the breeders think each one of these domestic types was descended from an original wild kind. But then, Darwin points out that naturalists know perfectly well, all these breeds of domestic pigeon were descended from the original kind, the columbolivia. Why is it that all the pigeon fanciers believe that there were an aboriginal wild type for each of the kinds, the pouter, the tumbler, the barb, whatever, and yet all the naturalists believe they were descended from a single type? Now here's what he does. He plays the breeder off against the naturalist. And what he basically affirms, if only the breeder would recognize the principle of the naturalist, descent, the breeder would recognize that these aboriginal or however many aboriginal wild forms are pure fictions, because what the naturalist fails to do is to add up slight variations over time. But then he turns it right around. But might not then the naturalist, who starts from these various kinds of ancestors, recognize that behind each of those is a long chain of development? So you see, there's an epistemological contest that goes on in chapter 1. You see what this contest is about is essentially the argument to design, updated for a world of change. You see, what Darwin is taking is, let me explain to you how things come to be designed. And he takes an example that is rhetorically sound. If you want to persuade someone, you must start from a premise of your opponent. See, that's a crucial thing. Cardinal Newman called it antecedent probability. If I want to convince you, what I have to discover and get you to believe, I must start with a belief you already hold. Now here is a belief in design. We all believe in the superiority of English cattle, and we all believe in, patriotically as well as scientifically, we better believe in the superiority of our pride of domestic husbandry, the various races of domestic English plants and animals. Now, he then redefines, you see, what is meant by design. Yes, these are designed. Let me show you how we have designed them, and we've really perfected this art. But then he naturalizes this notion, because this design that we have creates the illusion, you see, of, what this design we have shows how you can get one kind of thing from another kind of thing through a series of transitional grades. But the people that practice this don't realize the full power of their own principle. And then on the other hand, the taxonomists that show the fact of change from a single kind that is very much unlike to its descendants, these people fail to realize that even that single kind must have had, you know, all these predecessors. Throughout the origin, then, we have this analogy of domestic design or domestic selection. See, that's where we get the notion of selection. And then he reads the principle of selection back into nature. That is the task of the other chapters. In chapter 2, for example, we don't hear about selection, but he refers to nature as a manufactory of species. So that there's an analogy with manufacturing going on in species. And then we have in chapter 3 this tremendously vivid account of the competition in nature. He uses the analogy of a wedge, that nature is wedged like 1,000 wedges, 10,000 wedges closely put together. We get the image of one being hit and another falling out. And so we already believe in the competition. We recognize that nature is competition. And then he shows how Malthus's logic is basically operating, but you see, Malthus's logic is now seen from the reader from the standpoint of domestic breeding. So you see, you both have a denial and an affirmation of intelligent design at the same time. You are redefining the meaning of terms. This is socially revolutionary. But you see, this is how the thing is done. Language itself must change. I must find in your conventional beliefs the material that will overcome your conventional beliefs. And so what Darwin does is use the example of the breeder to domesticate the idea of chance variations from Malthus. And then we play the breeder against the naturalist, and we end up with a process that would allow us, when we add up the differences, to account for change over time. So then we get in chapter 4, natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the whole world, every variation, even the slightest, silently and insensibly working wherever and whenever, and I'm paraphrasing now, opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being in relationship to life. That's a wild and irresponsible personification. There's no such thing. And everyone that understands Darwin understands perfectly well there's no such thing. But notice what's happened. What's happened to the deity. The deity, the function of deity, of designing, has now been read into nature. And then you read it out again. And that essentially makes social sense. So you see, there's a thing that is technically false, but socially intelligible. And that is central to the origin of species. It is a delicate balance between what we might call algorithmic and prudential reason. The algorithmic reason is the logic of Malthus, operating on these slight variations in various biogeographic contexts. The prudential reason, but the algorithmic reason, you see, is socially absurd. The personification of nature under the figure of the breeder prevents or blocks the impact of the absurdity of the algorithmic reason, and makes what otherwise would be socially irrational, socially intelligible, indeed even persuasive.
What were the major objections to Darwin's Origin of Species, And how did he respond to them?
Well, a couple of major objections to Darwin's theory is, I mean, the famous one, of course, is the geologic record, the geologic column. And a second major objection is the argument from complexity, the lack of transitional forms. I mean, they're related. Now, straight up, if we were simply to turn to, I believe it's chapter 10 of The Origin, where Darwin takes up, chapter 10 in the first edition, where Darwin takes up the issue of geology, he admits straight up that if someone wants a reason for dismissing his theory, that geology seems dead against it. But the numbering of the chapter 10 is some key to how this is done. This comes late in the explanatory sequence. The Origin of Species, it does not divide itself this way, but it falls into roughly three conceptual units. One unit, and different people will count it differently, but I count the first 5 chapters as a unit. Variation under domestication, variation under nature, struggle for existence, and natural selection. And then we have chapter 5, which takes up various morphological problems, various miscellaneous objections, which he has brought up in chapter 1. It's a larger explication of chapter 1. So while in effect the theory is sort of complete by chapter 4, really chapter 5 deals with some unfinished business of chapter 1. Then chapters 6 through 9 deal with various objections. Darwin says in chapter 6 that you won't have read, long before the reader will have gotten to this place, various objections will have come, and some of them are so serious that he still feels their force. So you see, that brings us, those next 3 chapters deals with objections. And then we get into the positive things. Chapters 9 through 13 deal with geological and geographic. They deal with biogeography, is what they deal with. A couple of chapters on geology, a couple of chapters on geography, and then, if my math is right, we're at the conclusion. Then we have in chapter 13, we've got embryology, morphology, and taxonomy, and then chapter 14 leads us to the conclusion. Well, I apologize for the length of the account, but what you must understand, by chapter 10, you have been rehearsed through a series, you've been trained as a reader, if the book has had any effect on you, and you'd better, what can I say, be very powerfully inoculated for it not to have an effect upon you. You must be very rhetorically obtuse. You are prepared when you come to that chapter on geology that he says overtly, you can drop it here because I can't come up with the transitional grades. You, dear reader, has been through a very lengthy education about seeing transitional forms. And what he does in chapter 1 with respect to the pigeons, he does throughout these chapters with a variety of transitions. You have been made, you've got an anticipation of chapter 10, the geologic chapter, in the middle of chapter 4. Only the hardy reader will have gone into those interior regions. But in the middle of chapter 4, you have the classic illustration of what we're all familiar with, the phylogenetic tree. And this, he explains very clearly how various things branch, and you will have been rehearsed through these. What we've seen in domestication, he has taken you through in nature. Chapter 4, he will say, imagine a family of wolves. I have no difficulty in imagining some family of wolves in a situation where they go for deer, and the deer are, very fast, so only the most fleet wolves after a period will have been developed. Or imagine another circumstance where another family has less fleet prey. I can imagine easily 2 different families of wolves. You have been trained as a reader to see gradual variations and see divergence. In chapter 6, you get a whole series of transitional forms. Squirrels, flying squirrels. He will take you from a squirrel with a slightly flattened tail to just the suggestion of membrane, to a little more, to those that jump a little further, to gliders, and then he will say, We have an anomaly in the flying lemur. There are absolutely no transitional grades. No other lemur has this capacity, not real flight, but to glide. I have no difficulty whatsoever in imagining the transitional grades, and neither reader will you. He will then pose for himself in subsequent chapters difficult cases. Here's an objection to natural selection. He will pose, how can you account for ants making slaves? Now, how could you ever do such a thing? And he will give you an account where ants make slaves. How can you account for, I believe that they are sterile bees? How could you ever, give up the reproductive function on a theory that requires? He gives you an account, always transitional grades. He's gone through so many examples of transitional grades, and as you move forward, he gets even bolder. This will stop the theory short, and then he has an explanation. He'll come up with another one. This will stop the theory short, and then he gives this. They are, every one of, this is a terrible way of putting it because we can't say it in English. These are tours de force. And there's a whole series of these natural selection epiphanies. And by the time you get to 10, what cannot, gradual things accomplish? If they can do this, the argument form is called a fortiori. It's to the stronger. And these are a series of appeals to experience coming from the breeder. If we got this remarkable thing from the breeder, and we get these remarkable examples from nature, what may not nature accomplish by these small transitional grades? Now we come to chapter 10. Well, I admit, the transitional grades that we ought to find, we don't find. And the explanation I have, many people will not find credible. And it has to do with the tremendous imperfection of the geological record. Well, some people might suspect here a kind of a scam. I have this remarkable thing that will make these species. The only problem is, in the logic of its operation, it erases its traces. Because you see, as I explained back in chapter 4, by the very logic of competition, the ancestral forms, which would have been but a few, are erased by the very competition that produces the better adapted variations. So you see, on the one part, you wouldn't expect to find many transitional forms, given the nature of this thing. And then I add to this the tremendous imperfection of the geological record. Now here he pulls on convention. This isn't an invention out of whole cloth. He deals with his geological mentor, Charles Lyell, The Principles of Geology, 1830, 1833, 3 volumes. And Lyell himself compares the world to a book. But an encyclopedia, but one missing many volumes. And we only occasionally get a chapter here and there. And Darwin picks up on this analogy and talks about the imperfection of the record. And we begin to see it. That's right. That's what it's like. That's a principle we recognize. Then you put these two things together, the way the mechanism functions. You wouldn't expect many transitions. And then you put together the fact that only under conditions of subsidence would we expect when the continent is going down, and then you would have mudslides, et cetera, that would preserve only certain special circumstances would you get things preserved anyway. It begins to make sense that what is empirically you would say is so self-evident, sudden appearance and distinct kinds, which is how admittedly it appears, that isn't how it is really. That is simply an artifact of how things happen to be preserved. And what makes it very difficult, you see, if you want to embarrass Darwin, you can always take that up and point out the empirical facts don't support it. But remember, we're dealing with chapter 10 in the experience of the reader. And what I'm arguing for is a process that can only be accounted for by reconditioning. Darwin is psychologically reconditioning the reader's perception of the natural world. And by the time you get, dear reader, to chapter 10, you see transitional grades everywhere. If you study it carefully, if you grapple with this book, and Darwin urges, he does this very clearly in his correspondence, he says, to really understand my book, you have to read it at least twice. Well, I'd put that as a conservative estimate. You see, part of what's at risk here is to read his book, you must enter his world. And there's aspects of this book that really do invite you to enter his world because, dear reader, his world is really your world. Darwin appeals to, again, referring to Newman's notion of antecedent probabilities. If I'm going to persuade you of something, really persuade you, I must begin with something that you already believe. And so we already believe in the power and the achievement of British domestic husbandry. We have seen the power as indicated in the price that our animal and plant productions command throughout the world. We know the power that we have to transform the shape of living nature. Now I appeal to your humility. If man can do this, cannot nature? Anything that man can do, nature can do better. That's right, I'm humbled. And what we understand then, through this process, we have the process of our domestic and international triumph read back into nature as a cosmic principle of development, thereby proving our humility and recognizing this must be not just the way we work, but this, in fact, is the way God works. And that's why in chapter 4 of The Origin of Species, do we not here find products of a far higher workmanship? Again, I urge to you, what is being done is the argument of design is not being jettisoned, it's being reinvented. It is being reinvented for a period of triumphant capitalism. It is being reinvented for an audience that sees design in nature and is now being shown that this design is progressive, something that everybody half believes as part of the background knowledge of growing up British in the early 19th century, or American, the Industrial Revolution. All this makes sense. As Canon Kingsley explained, and Darwin was very quick to incorporate Kingsley's little aphorism into The Origin of Species itself. I have learned from Mr. Darwin that God is even more wise and more powerful than I had thought. He is so wise and so powerful, he makes all things to make themselves. So what Darwin is able to do is to incorporate his view into a pre-existent perspective that's all there. In one of my essays, I refer to this as the grammar of culture. You see, Darwin's rhetoric is effective because it is built on a prior cultural grammar. And that's how you answer the catch-22 of intellectual revolution. How can you make a fundamental change when a revolutionary change would seem to cancel the common ground that you hold? No, you appeal to common ground, but then you redefine the meaning of the terms in process. But an important question is how does Darwin deal with the empirical evidence? Because when we, at the end of the day, the geological column remains. There it is. It is dead against him. And he recognizes that, in fact, if anyone wants to disagree with him, that they can do so by appealing to the geological record, and he acknowledges that straight up. But what I want to urge is that that is in Chapter 10, and that by the time you reach Chapter 10, he has given you so many examples of small increments making big differences, and you have been thoroughly informed as to the mistake, dear reader, of both the breeder and the naturalist. And you see, as reader, you are invited to share a higher position. Here these clever breeders that have produced these triumphs of our domestic husbandry, they don't even recognize their own principle. And he says, the problem, I've talked to so many breeders, not one breeder, not one pigeon fancier, every one of them believes that there are as many aboriginal forms as there are these forms that are the product of their art, that their art wasn't much. They fail to add up small differences over time. And then the breeders are just the flip side, the naturalists are just the flip side of that mistake. They just start with a species as given, and when they come back, for an example of the pigeon, to the Columbolivia, they think that's the beginning of pigeons. They don't apply the technique of the breeder to recognize that pigeon itself was descended from something that was not quite yet a columba liva, and so on ad infinitum, till we finally get to one or perhaps a few primordial forms from which all else came. Now, the rhetorically important thing here, see, we have a question, and many critics of Darwin raise this question. There is the hard facts wall, there is the geologic column, and the fossils say no, et cetera, et cetera. To say that the evidence is irrelevant would be to put it unkindly. What I wish to suggest very strongly is that the perceptions of the reader have been thoroughly changed by the time that we get to chapter 10. Now, I've been accused of saying what you're assuming, Campbell, that somebody's going to read it straight through and nobody could stay awake that long. Well, I have some objections there. I think The Origin of Species is a fascinating book to read, but perhaps it requires a great deal of vegetable passion, shall we say, to read it from chapter 1 to chapter 10. I'm not assuming that you're going to read it all at one sitting. But what I'm urging is a cumulative effect. There is no design accident with respect to the positioning of chapter 10. Chapter 10 comes after the objections have been met. And now you are in a position to so see transitional grades that where there are none, you will imagine there must have been some. Because you see, by this time, you must pay a cost for disbelief. And the cost for disbelief is to deny what the breeder has achieved. You must deny also the principle that forms of life only come into being by generation from previous forms. If you refuse to fill in the blanks in that column, you have betrayed British science, patriotism, and the principle of scientific reason itself. Now, if you want a good example of that, you need to read the very conclusion of chapter 5, because you might say that the grounds for chapter 10 are prepared in the conclusion of chapter 5. I mean, this is an exaggeration because the grounds are prepared severally, variously in all the chapters. But there's a very important move. Chapter 5 seems kind of an odd chapter, and it doesn't really, it strengthens his argument in many ways by giving a much more detailed account of the what today we call, for want of a better term, the genetic aspect of his theory, what we know about inheritance. But at the end of it, he talks about the various races of the domestic horse. Well, not the domestic horse, but the various races of horse. We have the quagga, the hemionus, the zebra, we have the burro. A domestic horse of many kinds throughout the world will occasionally be born with stripes on its shoulders, down its back, on its flanks. Are you telling me, Darwin says, that these stripes do not bear the mark of a common ancestor? And Darwin looks back, and it's important, dear reader, that you learn to do what Philip Kitcher has called Darwinian histories. And this is the capacity to look back genealogically, to look back genetically, and in your imagination, if you cannot do it literally. And Darwin sees an animal in many ways like the horse, in some ways different, striped. And you see what he says is, I would as soon believe with the ancient cosmographer that the fossils in the mountains had never lived, but were given to mock the living forms on the seashore, as I would to believe that these stripes on our domestic horse are not the marks of a common ancestor. You see what happens through that, and then through the series of other examples that happen in chapters 6 through 9, you are rehearsed through a series of transitional grades for individual structures like the eye, for habits, ants making slaves, sterility in insect colonies, a whole series of examples that would seem impossible to account for on the basis of slight variations. Every time, by a tour de force of argument, Darwin is showing you at least how it's conceivable that slight variations would have been useful to the individual or to the community, and that all the transitional stages would have been there, would have been useful, even if they're not there presently to see. So by the time you come to chapter 10, you have seen many, many, many examples of what seem like characteristics, either structures or functions, that would appear to the naive mind must have been specially created. You can understand them the same way you can understand domestic breeding. So you come to chapter 10, well, how can he assert such a thing? With high ontological epistemic stakes. I will admit to you, Darwin says, the cache isn't here. But I appeal to you on the basis of the imperfection of the geological record. I appeal to you on the logic of my mechanism, which by its very operation, extinction on this theory is as much a part of Darwin's theory as is origins. I appeal the very logic of this would have erased the transitional forms. I appeal to those two things together to show why they wouldn't be there. But there's another thing also he appeals to, and that is the cost you must pay for denying that those transitions must have been there. And that cost is absolute irrationality. If you deny that my transitional forms have been there, then you are right back. You see, he refers to the ancient cosmographer who said that the fossil shells have been created to mock the ones on the seashore. Let me just explain what that means. The year before, or maybe it was a couple years before, but I think it was just the year before The Origin of Species was published, a fellow by the name of Gosa published a book called Omphalos. Omphalos is Greek for navel, in the sense of belly button. And what this book showed, it raises the question, did Adam have a navel? Well, you might think, what a trivial question. Well, if Adam had a navel, God created Adam with the marks of an ancestry he never had. That's the fossils. So on this thing, on this perspective, you see the fossil record is a temptation, an intellectual temptation, that we would not believe in the biblical account, because God created also the world by parody of his creation of man with the marks of an ancestry it never had. Darwin invokes that in chapter 5. It's part of the implicit decision context for chapter 10. Your denial of the transitional grades means, given all the other evidence for transition we have seen, from horses to termites to bees to complex structures such as eyes, if you don't believe that there were transitional grades, then you basically have removed yourself from the rational hope of science for finding intelligibility in the material world. In other words, the marks of descent in the world are so clear that to deny it makes God a liar. Now you see, there is another way in which a revolution is formed. God I have been taken in. Now, this is a very powerfully persuasive book, as I said. Darwin, and people do confuse them. There is a distinction. Darwin has taken the most powerful social beliefs, including an invocation of the divine, on his own side. And so you see, I mean, he will give you this argument. I'm quite candid about this. We can find it in The Origin in several places. When the going gets tough, Darwin will evoke the divine for his own side. On the example, for example, I've already given you one from chapter 5. This doctrine, meaning Gosa's doctrine, that the fossil shells in the hills have been created to mock the living ones on thing, he says, and I quote, "It makes the works of God a mockery and a deception." Now, the point I want to rhetorically insist on is that special creation in The Origin makes the works of God a mockery and a deception. There is no lying in Darwin's universe. The transition, if special creation has said the rocks don't lie or the fossils say no, Darwin says the transitional forms don't lie. And the very fact that we can make as many as 9 different kinds of species from a common one kind, which if given to an ornithologist would catalog them as distinct. If we can do that, anything man can do, nature can do more. Can you deny that? And then he just reads the transitions into the record. He gives us examples where we know the transition, the squirrels, flying squirrels, to places where we don't have transitions, flying lemurs. Do you deny that there were them? Then that all prepares us for the big one, which is chapter 10. There are not any at all, or very few. Do you deny that they've been there? Okay, you can deny it. I haven't got the cash. But the cost is you no longer believe in the possibility that the world is intelligible to the human mind. And by the way, that is part of the cost of disbelief. It's invoked again in chapter 14 when he talks about looking at the world this way, it seems like a great machine that has within it the mistakes, the blunders of many workmen. So you see, the Origin of Species ends in a referendum on 19th century in technological rationality. And to deny the argument is to deny the very principle of progress that seems to be so evident in the world around you. Now you see, I'm telling you all of these things not exactly in a critical spirit. I mean to be praising Darwin, and I mean to be making a very important point. And that is that we're dealing here with the rhetorical genius of the first order. To be able to, Darwin is a mastery of prudential reason. And that is how we reason about moral questions, ethical questions, how we reason in areas where there is no clear proof. And Darwin says quite candidly in the introduction to The Origin, the little prefatory thing, that this is just an abstract. I can't give full evidence, and you could certainly give every fact I've got, you could argue the other side. Well, that is how things are in the world, and that's why rhetoric is intellectually important, because many of the most important decisions there are, and what could be more important than the question of origins? Many of the most important decisions they can be argued both ways. So how do you bring people across that enormous gulf from believing that the world and all that is in it were designed by a beneficent and wise God to belief that these very structures, as Dawkins tells us, were the product of a blind watchmaker? Well, I hope that what I've said has given some indication about how that's done, because that's a very serious intellectual question. How is it done? And part of the contribution of a rhetoric of science to our understanding of science is an appreciation of the way in which science and culture are interconnected. Darwin finds in prior cultural beliefs the very foundation to undermine the conclusions that everyone thought were certain given on those beliefs. There is a term for this process in rhetoric. Aristotle in his Rhetoric talks about the topics. Topics are basically places you go to discover argument. In a court of law, for example, the question of fact. Well, did you commit the crime? Was there a crime committed? Okay, yeah, there was a crime committed. Then the question of definition. Well, was it murder? Yes, this person was killed. Yes, it was murder. Were there extenuating circumstances? And yes, I killed the person. Yes, it was murder. No, there weren't extenuating circumstances, but your court doesn't have jurisdiction. I mean, those would be 4 topics where places you go for a defined argument in the court of law. Well, there's many topics on many questions, but Darwin has some very interesting topics. Aristotle has some interesting topics that we find in Darwin. One of them I find most amusing is Aristotle's topic, if it were not so, we never would have believed it. You see, ancient rhetoricians had to deal with questions that would seem technically absurd. Well, if I am a little man, I'm accused of murdering this great one. How could that possibly be? It seems improbable. Well, there you have it. Well, how do you overcome that argument if someone uses against you? Well, there are many things that are so, but no one ever would have ever believed them if it weren't for the fact. Why do fish need salt, seeing as they live in the sea? I'm using actual examples now. Why do olives need oil, seeing as they make oil? So what I'm saying is that part of the art of rhetoric is to recognize various recurrent social situations where probability is matched against probability, and then to discover the socially approved belief that you could then mobilize to get people to see the force of your point. And this is why I think Cardinal Newman's term antecedent probability is so important. Darwin's Origin of Species, if you didn't want to read it for its biology, you could read it for its sociology. It tells you a great deal about a 19th century belief system. And it tells you about the resources of argument that are available to get people from here to there in a case that can be argued clearly, both sides. Darwin recognizes it can be argued both sides. And what would anyone do in a case like that, and where the proof is absent, thin, or outright missing, but to up the ante for disbelief? You can disbelieve in me here, but it will cost you. And what will cost you is something that's very dear to you, the belief that the world in principle is intelligible to the human mind. And that itself was an important belief of the very tradition of natural theology that Darwin inherited.
How have your views of Darwinian theory changed over the years?
Well, I've always been a little skeptical, but skeptical in a benign sense. One can both affirm something and be skeptical of it at the same time. I will never forget my first reading of Darwin, which was pretty cold turkey. I had absolutely no preparation for this reading in my prior academic studies, so here my thesis advisor suggests, well, why don't you do a rhetorical analysis of the origin of species? It hasn't been done. Well, I would advise anyone hearing my voice to be very careful in taking seriously what your thesis advisor tells you. So in any event, I was naive enough to take it on. I read The Origin of Species. I thought that was a responsible place to begin. What struck me about The Origin of Species in my first reading was the tremendous courage required to believe it. And this was a most friendly comment in which I really regarded Darwin as an intellectual hero. Because when one understands quite candidly and with anybody's polemical views or special agendas aside, to believe such a thing on the basis of the evidence that Darwin is presenting us is a great act of intellectual courage. And I can certainly believe Darwin when he says that every time he thinks of the eye, it gives him cold shudders. It really is something to take an idea. Think of how many times one has an idea, gee, yeah, that would be true, and then one in one's mind. Oh well, it would never answer, and then we let it go. But what would it be to have a mind that could wrestle with these tremendous things and to throw these light threads, or seemingly light threads, across great grand canyons of evidence and have the courage and the skill to tightrope walk from here to there? So my first response was one of great admiration, coupled the admiration one has of a tightrope walker. My, this is a very thin rope, and that is a very deep gap of empirical evidence. That hardly led to me disbelieving in it, largely because my thinking was taking place within the cultural context of the Darwinian revolution. And that is the assumption that to explain scientifically is to explain by natural law. And the way in which I understood, so I could see what I called the courage of Darwin and the tremendous problems of the evidence without ever it disturbing my belief in the theory, because something like the theory had to be true. Well, I mean, it really does, doesn't it? If the world is intelligible to our minds on the basis of such analogies as Darwin presents to us, some version of transmutation, the development of one kind out of the other, has to be the case. If natural selection is wrong, then some other principle must establish the same kind of thing. Because either one kind of thing was developed from an earlier sort of thing, or they were suddenly made to appear, which would imply some process of which we have no comprehension and no analogy, and the almost inevitable inference that that something would be an inference to intelligence. As I've struggled with the evidence more and have read more of the skepticism of others being much more, I can admire courage when I see it without necessarily having it myself, I've really come to see through Denton's work, through the work of Steve Meyer, of many other people who have written on this, of Michael Behe, that there really are deficits in the evidence. And particularly as I've read many of the defenders. Frankly, many of the defenders have stiffened my spine. I think I would heartily recommend Stephen Gould's It's a Wonderful Life to anyone. And one understands that many of the predictions that must be true on this model are not panning out. One realizes that the history of Darwinism, particularly in the 20th century, has been the history of its revisions. That from the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 1940s to the present day, that there increasingly have been difficulties in the theory. I particularly was impressed with a paper by a friend and colleague of mine, Art Bateson, that I think well summarizes a number of the objections to the theory. And particularly I was impressed with his expression, which certainly echoes what I'd been reading from Gould, that taxonomic disparity precedes specific diversity. Well, if you followed the logic of the origin, if you've suffered through, did not fall asleep during chapter 4, and if you've come to see all those transitional grades, and if you've struggled, really struggled, to see what he's talking about with respect to those phylogenetic trees, then you understand quite clearly that species diversity has to come first before there is taxonomic disparity. And when it sinks in, what Gould has shown us from the Burgess Shale, that there are distinct forms, that they're very early on, and we have no transitional grades early to them, that at least has to give one pause. And if one follows this with Mike Behe and others' arguments, that there's a minimum amount of complexity that you need for things to function at all, then one realizes that what Darwin is talking about in chapter 10 may in fact be fact, and that the idea of transitional grades may not be a credible idea at all. One entertains at very least the possibility of a radically different world picture, a world picture as radically different from the prevailing Darwinian orthodoxy in which I was born and that my mother imparted to me, in which I have no motive to question. One realizes intellectually there is the possibility for a view of the world, for a view of the origin and development of life, for even of questions of purpose, as radically different from the Darwinian as the Darwinian was from the prevailing theistic view that preceded it. So my own personal view is I've become a Darwinian skeptic. I'm prepared to believe that Darwinism was an impressive artifact of 19th century thought. It remains a permanent monument to the courage of the human intellect. I'm increasingly of the opinion it may not be true.
What is your opinion of Philip Johnson's critique of philosophical naturalism in his book, Darwin on Trial?
My impression of Phil's book is that it is a very important work. What it does is attempts to begin the first steps in a different direction of what Darwin himself began. And that is, the book is an attempt to change the terms of academic debate. Now, irrespective of where one stands on the question of the truth of Darwinism, I think every person of goodwill has an interest in having a context in which ideas of a variety of different shades can be discussed. Now, in the current academic context, to try to raise questions critical of the prevailing orthodoxy, and let us make no mistake of what that prevailing orthodoxy is, that a prevailing orthodoxy is defined not only by Darwin's theory in part is but a symptom or expression. That prevailing orthodoxy is defined, I think, by what Phil aptly calls scientific naturalism. And basically this is the assumption that the world is a self-enclosed system of self-acting laws. And that's it. That the idea of a purpose, one of the great questions, incidentally, that people have asked, the idea of a direction is senseless because Darwinian biology, predominantly, has shown us that all questions of purpose are meaningless. They are simply reduced to questions of power, contingent adaptation, and that the only purpose we can speak of biologically, which means really, is simple reproduction. That is all there is. I think that suggesting perhaps that some of the traditional questions, even some of the questions that Kant suggested, in what may I believe, in what may I trust, what may I know, to raise those questions in a radical sense, admitting the possibility that scientific naturalism itself might not be final, but might be a phase in the larger human epistemic project. To question that assumption is to perform an enormous intellectual service for people of all persuasions. For people who are of the persuasion of scientific naturalism and whose Darwinism is an outgrowth in that fundamental metaphysical commitment, these people need their own position sharpened by the bracing and refreshing challenge of colleagues who genially disagree with them. That service cannot be performed in a vacuum. And I think what Phil wants to do is let the captives go free. And the captives of the prevailing paradigm, I say not in a negative sense, meaning that these people are irredeemably lost to the life of intellect. I'm saying that their own perspective would be invigorated and would gain new nuance and aspect by a really bracing and free exchange with people who really disagree with them, who think that the full range of Kant's questions are open, that there might be a God, there might indeed be some good reason to suppose there were, based on physical evidence. There might be some very damaging bits of naturalistic evidence that do not tell well for the Darwinian paradigm, and if stripped of the metaphysical assumption of naturalism, we might at least see the possibility of an alternative horizon. Now, the essence to me of liberal education is to be able to see a variety of alternative landing fields. And it seems to me that people who adhere to scientific naturalism have only to gain by recognizing the intellectual integrity or entertaining the possibility of the intellectual integrity of, say, a revived argument to design. Isn't it an intellectually interesting question that such a thing might be possible? Under what conditions would such a picture be taken seriously, just as a matter of intellectual interest? And might it not be possible to meet with some colleagues that really disbelieve in the Darwinian concept or the Darwinian context, but are intellectually well-trained? And wouldn't it be interesting to have a real discussion about the nature of things that was not precluded or not hedged in by certain conclusions introduced in advance about what that nature must be in advance of discovery? You see, for me, the Darwinian discussion, irrespective of the conclusions that people might draw from it, is informed by a deeply rhetorical perspective on reality and truth. In the rhetorical tradition, one of our central canons is invention. And what invention is guided by are topics. I explained a little bit about topics before. But you see, the marvelous thing about topical reason is it makes it possible to conduct an intellectual inquiry without prejudice to what the outcome of that inquiry might be. Because one raises a series of questions, And to use an expression of Bernard Lonergan, one follows the desire to know. One is obedient to no prior orthodoxy, but one is obedient only to the immanent intelligibility of one's own questions. Now, the questions that Phil Johnson is asking are intelligible questions. They are respectable questions. Indeed, they are traditional questions. I'm very concerned that we have an academic atmosphere in which it's possible to ask those questions and to entertain the full range of possible answers without prejudice. I do not think that's possible under the current system. One of the things about Johnson's book that influenced me most is not only what he says in the book, and I'm impressed very much by his critique of scientific naturalism, his critique of the Darwinian model. Particularly, I'm impressed by his chapter about the behavior of people at the British Museum who tried to give an orthodox Darwinian reading to various exhibits that questioned various aspects of the theory. But I'm impressed with Johnson not only by his works, but by his words. That is to say, his personal conduct. I had a meeting of some colleagues of mine at the university, a dinner meeting at a local restaurant. And these are colleagues I respected and I continue to respect, but I was very much informed by their treatment of him. These very competent, highly trained intellectuals spent an hour or so making it impossible for Johnson ever to get to first base. He must be defeated in advance. And that little experiment, that little experience, as much as anything that Phil had written, and I respect what Phil writes very much, that experience dropped the scales from my eyes. There really is such a thing as scientific naturalism. It really is an ideology. It really does want to cover the entire intellectual framework. And many of my colleagues and friends at the university really do want to keep other points of view out. I say that as a confession of personal experience, and I'm sorry to report it, but I do believe it is true. And it is my fidelity to that truth, perhaps more than any positive conviction about the ultimate outcome of this debate, that makes me put my energy on the side of questioning this prevailing paradigm, because I do think it is a dogma. I do think this dogma is uncritical, and I do think that believing in it unreflectively is a sin against the intellect. And indeed, it is a great obstacle to liberal education and liberal thought if we are, prior to all discussion, to limit thought only to certain predetermined avenues. I believe that is not in keeping with my idea of a liberal education or a university as a real community of scholars.